I've been meaning to revisit The Ring from 2002 for a while now, and after my friend Zach from the They Live By Film podcast watched it, it urged me back into it, and man, I'm glad I did, because I'm fairly certain this is the perfect American remake, meaning a remake of a foreign movie of which there is no shortage. The Western world, America especially, has had this obsession with remaking every single foreign movie that has any sort of acclaim because executives and such have no faith in Western audiences being able to interact with foreign art, especially those coming out of Asia. And there was a huge wave in the 2000s of American remakes of Asian horrors, namely The Grudge, Dark Water, Pulse, The Uninvited, Shutter, and of course The Ring. There were other remakes of other continental horrors such as the Spanish film Wreck being remade into Quarantine in 2008, but the one thing that made The Ring stand above the rest immediately is the creative minds behind it, namely one creative mind, the director, Gore Verbinski. Gore Verbinski is most famously the director of the Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy and Rango, or for horror fans, A Cure for Wellness, but before that he directed The Ring, which is a bizarre jump for him considering the only things to his name before that was the child's film Mouse Hunt and the comedy adventure film The Mexican, neither of which would naturally point towards his talents in the horror genre, but here we are. Now getting into The Ring, I think we should obviously first address that The Ring is a remake of the 1998 Japanese classic Ringu, directed by Hideo Nakata, an instant classic to hit its homeland and was insanely well received and popular. On a personal note, I've always had love for the original. It freaked me out massively when I was a kid, but as I grew up, I've come to the conclusion that Ringu isn't actually that scary, which is okay. I think the film's greatest asset is not its scares, but its storytelling. It's supernatural world building in a natural world. It's shot very matter of fact, and the aesthetic of the film goes towards that strength, but the remake is not at all like that. It definitely leans into the scares, leans into the tension, the atmosphere, leans into the supernatural world building that slowly turns its natural world into something other. I think what immediately strikes people more than anything about the difference in the two is the color grading. The Verbinski film adopts this green and blue color grading that is so deeply melancholic. It feels cold and wet. It actually set the trend of this look in horror for the 2000s, which if you've seen much horror of that decade, you know how prevalent the greens were of the time, but this film just does it the best. And that's completely due to the effort behind the scenes in making it. It isn't just simply color graded in post-production, which can often make this cheap, washed out effect. They were using custom camera filters and lenses to burn in those color choices on the day on the film. This speaks to such a solid creative choice. There's a conviction and certainty in this. Shooting as is and then color grading later leaves room for indecision, leaves room for change and more creative freedom in post. The techniques Verbinski and cinematographer Bojan Bezelli used are indicators that they knew exactly what they wanted, what they were going for. A true confidence in their competency and vision. There is so much greatness that went into the look of this film, but for more on that, I'd recommend the video Why the Ring Didn't Use Color Grading by watching the aerial, which goes into a lot of detail, far better than I could, and it's where I learned all that I know about the cinematography of this film. This is the first indicator that this film is attempting to separate itself from the original. The worst mistake a remake can make is not what people think. People always assume it's changing the source material, which I disagree with. I think it's sticking too closely to it. For a remake to be justified, you need to change it up in some way, give it a reason to exist artistically on its own merits, else what's the point besides being a cash grab? For example, take the aforementioned Dark Water, or even worse, Quarantine. Quarantine does everything Wreck does, but slightly worse and changes nothing, so ultimately feels completely worthless. The Ring doesn't do that. It changes quite a bit to westernize the story and also adds its own flares and ideas, visuals and such to make it stand out as a solo experience that you can't get from watching the original, and honestly, I think it improves upon the original in so many ways. And I know that sounds blasphemous because the original is so iconic, but let's not pretend that remakes cannot surpass their original counterparts. It's happened more than you'd think. Scarface, Remakes, The Thing, The Fly, A Star Is Born, True Grit, some of those being so much more popular and iconic than the first interpretation that people forget they're even a remake to begin with. The copy becomes the staple. And I think this film deserves that same treatment. It is just doing so much more with the material than the 98 film that it deserves recognition beyond just being a remake of that film. Like I said, the original isn't doing much in terms of visual identity. It's shot just very matter of fact, which works, but the way Verbinski and Buzzelli weave the visuals to match the growing intensity and otherworldly nature of the diegesis is masterful. Like this very specific shot of the apartments and office buildings surrounding Rachel, our protagonist. Every building is so similar and overlapping that it makes the entire cityscape feel blended into this unsolvable maze. It's just such an industrial and urban labyrinth that makes Rachel feel so much more trapped in her world so instantly. I said in my last video, and I'll say it now, and I'll probably say it again in my next, but the opening shot and sequence is the most important in any film, and in this I think it sets the tone perfectly. It sets up the premise, the myth, the visual language, and is so incredibly tense it makes me sick. The effects hold up generally, and Gore Verbinski is just such a master at blocking. I'd even go as far to say he's as perfect at it as Spielberg, who is pretty much the gold standard, using the cinematography and mise-en-scene to tell the story just as much as the script is. Just like that last shot I was talking about, there is just so much personality in every moment, and every second is masterfully put together that everything we see drives towards the progression of the story emotionally, or building the suspense of whatever emotion was supposed to be particularly feeling at that time. It's things like this that put this movie a step above the original in my opinion, which has a great concept and sets the blueprint out for this film, and this just uses the materials better so the structure is more sound and breathtaking in the end.
Rachel, please. I saw her face.
There are jump scares that are so well placed just like that, the way they're supposed to be used, not with this dramatic music that quickly halts and the movie takes a breath before releasing all the tension in a big musical cue that is most of the scare's avenue to deliver the jump. This is placed so naturally into a conversation you're genuinely invested in. There's not a moment you suspect a jump coming, and yes, there's a musical cue, but the visual is just as unexpected and throat lumping. And the tape itself, which the movie centers around, is just so much more creepy in this one for some reason, and when Rachel sees it we get this gorgeous shot of her eyes going into meiosis, and in general it just has a greater involvement in the story. It seems so much more important, the images feel less random, there's a greater sense of mystery in this one too. Rachel pushes this story forward, whereas in the original it kinda just feels like the plot points are moving along regardless of Reiko's participation. She's on a train that won't stop, whereas Rachel feels like the conductor of this locomotive. And with this train, there feels like there is just so much more urgency in solving the mystery of the tape than in the original, which is also a mystery but mostly gets solved by characters just explaining the backstory rather than the protagonist unraveling the story through will and desperation. And like many remakes, there isn't a stockpile of original content added to this story or novel concepts brought into the fold, but I think it just does everything the original does but better, and adds a new thing here and there that just adds more to the story overall. The visual style is more distinct and serves the emotions of the story in a more thoughtful way. The blocking and framing of every scene is more impactful, like this one moment of Rachel pulling this cable out of her mouth, or the way this vision is presented after. The film crafts a better narrative that engrosses the audience more in the history of its world. Samara feels like this presence that is getting ever closer to Rachel, growing increasingly more violent but also pained and in need of help, much more than just the tortured spirit of the original. Samara is just so much more terrifying in this than the original too. She genuinely brings out a pulsating fear in me that not many horror films manage to do, and dare I say, this is the film that made her a horror icon, not the 1998 film. But also, she's not just a terrifying horror villain, she's a tragedy. Her story makes me want to cry as much as it does terrify. There's a moment that's added into this narrative not found in the 98 version where a horse goes insane and jumps off a boat and into its propellers. You just see it jump, struggle in the water, and then the ocean turns red. It is absolutely stomach turning, just something so preternatural, so unsettling and off that the gore doesn't even need to be on display to make it sickening. The act itself is just so unnatural and perverted that it makes me feel fundamentally disgusted. It's just solid craftsmanship. Like, notice how in this scene where Rachel is watching Samara's psychiatric tapes, Verbinski calls your attention to this negative space by use of the lighthouse light, setting up the next shot of Richard who fills that space. It's of course simple but impossibly effective. The visual techniques used in building Samara's physical presence is immensely improved too. The leaking of the water, the condensation on the TV, the chill that hits the air, and her general presence and appearance is just so much more thought out. The effort is clear. It also builds the suspense even greater by use of the child, Aiden, who has much more of a role to play in the story than previous. His activeness in the narrative is a smart choice to building the mythos of Samara and making her presence feel more universal than typical hauntings. It also raises the stakes and gives the audience more things to fear for. And beyond the filmmaking, it just has a good cast. Of course, Naomi Watts as Rachel is inspired, but it has a great supporting cast too. Adam Brody shows up for literally one little moment and he captures the essence of the film so well in just that minute performance that it sticks until the end. Richard Lineback in his very little appearance also steals the show. And of course, Brian Cox is an extreme delight. There isn't a presence like him and he evokes such a history through just his expressions and limited dialogue. And this kid is so scary looking. The deep eyes already elicit a sense of unease and a daunting sadness he's cast so well. And in the end, I'm of the personal belief that Gore Verbinski should have handled all American remakes of Asian horrors of that time, especially Dark Water, which is another Hideo Nakata film that got an American remake which is undeniably weaker than the Japanese original, which I actually love quite a bit. What's fascinating is though The Ring, the American version, is widely accepted as an iconic and classic horror flick alongside the Hideo Nakata original, both of which are adapted from the book, but that's neither here nor there. Nakata came to direct the sequel of the American film, which was received quite poorly, which I think honestly speaks to the idea that Verbinski just understood this material better. His vision is so much better suited for it, and to me, his interpretation of it alongside all who made it happen is undeniably the perfect American remake. But that's just me. What do you think? Have you seen The Ring? If so, let me know what you think about it. If not, will you? And whether it's an American remake of an Asian horror or not, as always, keep watching movies.